Hello and welcome. And today I'm talking to Senator Jordon Steele-John. Jordon is Australia's youngest senator and the first with a lived experience of cerebral palsy. Prior to taking up the post of Senator for Western Australia in November 2017, Jordon dedicated his time to youth and disability advocacy and was also a student of politics at Macquarie University. Deeply involved with the Greens Party from a young age, Jordon is passionate about using his time in Parliament to act on climate change, reduce youth unemployment and implement a full NDIS. He is committed to helping break down some of the barriers holding back young people and disabled people from engaging with politics and ensuring that we make progress towards true representation. He does not want to be the last. And we would hope he isn't either. Welcome, Jordon. Thanks so much for making time for us today.
Thank you so much, Christina. Great to be with you.
Indeed. How did you end up doing this?
Well, I'm in some senses the most accidental politician in Australian history. I was kind of unexpectedly catapulted into to Parliament by the citizenship saga that happened a couple of months back. But more broadly, I've always been an activist and an advocate and really passionate about youth issues and disability issues in the context of a belief that for us to make real substantive progress in these areas, we need to have our voices, our lived experiences in the chambers of power, the places where the decisions are made. So I've, been a candidate many times and things on the back of the desire to do those things and lead those conversations. And as fate would have it, ended up being in one of those spaces, which I'm quite excited about.
Indeed. And how was it that you realised that politics was a useful way of pushing your particular message?
I think, look, I've always been, and I'll admit it openly, a bit of a political nerd. I've had a long, one of my earliest memories is a political memory. It's of the Tampa crisis in 2001 when I was about 6 years old, and I didn't understand the complexities of that, but I did understand that, as a young person, you're told, as a kid, you're told to help. If people ask for your help, that you kind of help them. And it was really clear that we weren't doing that, and that struck me as wrong. And it also struck me as, give me an idea of the power that politics has to change people's lives, depending on who is and isn't heard and who is and isn't considered important. I'm not saying I went from that to, turning off bananas in pajamas and watching Q&A. That would be worrying. But I did that stuck with me. And then around the time when, Rudd was elected, Obama was elected in 2008, these seemed to be big changes, and they were happening because people were getting involved with movements that were also political movements, and they were changing their communities and changing their countries. And I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be part of something that would help change my community for the better.
Is there some sort of difference between the activism space, that asking or demanding of outcomes from the outside, and being inside the Parliament, supposedly in a decision-making position?
Fantastic question. And I think this is probably one of the greatest misconceptions, that the Parliament self-perpetuates, if you like. And what I mean by that is there's a strong culture in the Australian political system that there is a delineation, a sharp dividing line between the activist and the campaigner, and the politician and the leader. And that to be the latter, you must give up the former. So you must cease to be an activist or a campaigner because you are entering a political decision-making space where the keywords are pragmatism and compromise and kind of a quiet, solemn going about of doing the business of government, if you like. And I think, if I can speak frankly, that that's a load of bollocks. I'm strongly of the opinion that you should be proud of your activist and advocacy spirit, and that is exactly what the political space needs. So I have I draw on my passions and my experiences and as an advocate and the skills that I gained in those spaces, and take those things and that spirit proudly into that decision-making space, because fundamentally that's the only way that you ever end up upsetting and redefining the nature of the status quo, which is so urgently what we need to do.
Yeah, and you know, at the moment, you're it, you're the kind of it for the disability
Yes.
community inside the parliament or the federal parliament, and you know, in some ways that must be quite isolating. But then you've also got this major kind of educative role, and you've been working on both of those. How is that travelling? Given you're only 6 months in, let's be honest, you haven't had a huge amount of time to change the world yet, but is there, you talk about the need to change the status quo, but is it really simply being in that room, in that Senate chamber, having that impact? Is it making that difference?
Well, I mean, I think one of the fundamental, so what we need as a community, if you look at the challenges that the disabled people face, yes, there is a need to change process, to reform process so that it functions more effectively, to facilitate the realization of people's rights. But process change can only take you so far. What we truly need is cultural change, or at least a combination of the cultural and the procedural. And that is where you can drive that cultural change from those political spaces, whether or not you get your particular bill through Parliament, say. You can make a contribution to that cultural shift by being there and speaking, by talking about the fact that we still haven't had a Royal Commission into violence, abuse, and neglect, by talking frankly about the failures of the NDIS as well as its transformational opportunities, by talking about the need to make sure that our public spaces and institutions are physically accessible, as I've done in relation to the Parliament, not only because every disabled Australian has the right to serve their communities in an elected capacity and to work in that institution, but also because of the profound message that the inaccessibility of those spaces sends to the broader community. So you can drive those cultural changes from those spaces. As to what I've achieved so far, look, I think I'm happy with some things. I'm happy that we've managed to make some of the infrastructure changes to the Parliament that has been needed. But I'm also disappointed that those changes haven't gone further, and that there's been a let's fix it for Jordon rather than let's undertake the systemic change that's needed. And there's still a lot of work to do in that space, and there's a hell of a lot of work to do beyond the Parliament in the general community. But I have had a lot of contact from members of the disability community talking about them feeling more now that the political space is one in which their voice and their presence belongs and is needed. And that is, for me, each communication in that vein is a small victory, because it is our right to be in those spaces, and nobody really has told us that, because nobody's been there to do that. So I'm definitely happy about that. Yeah,
and it's interesting because we've been up there in our lobbying capacity, in our NGO capacity for the 30 years that the building's been there, and it's always been horrifically inaccessible. It's a dreadful building. People are surprised by that because it's so new. But I wonder whether that there's a certain unavoidableness about the fact that you're in the room. That a whole bunch of people who can politely say they care about disability, but because we're not there, they can talk about it differently, suddenly have to not just be polite, but have to allow for the fact that you're there, and disability is as legitimate a background as any other.
Absolutely. Yes, there's a strange, there is that. So, I mean, it definitely, they can't say, that they don't know or see anybody or work with anybody with a disability on a daily basis. There's also a strange social phenomenon in the Parliament where, because I've now been elected and I'm therefore part of this strange kind of club, people are the MPs that make the decisions are kind of required to, culturally required to see me as their equal, because that's something that's extended to everybody that's in that place, regardless of political affiliation. And it was very interesting when I first arrived and started talking about the need for a Royal Commission into violence, abuse and neglect. I was talking to members of both sides about, why haven't we seen progress in this space? It seems like such a no-brainer that we would take a unanimous Senate committee recommendation and act on it. That it was shocking to receive the response that nobody was actually sure why we hadn't done that yet, and that nobody had really thought about why they hadn't done that, or and which was ridiculous, because we had been talking about the need for a Royal Commission every 10 seconds since we made the recommendation, but nobody had heard it until a disabled person who was also a senator and therefore worth listening to said about the need for it to happen. Now, it still hasn't happened, so that realization didn't lead to action, but it's interesting to see those tiny little observations occur in people's minds.
If the Senate chamber had 15 senators with disabilities in it,
pardon me, yes,
if there were 15 disabled senators, what do you envisage would be the cultural shift in that regard?
Well, I think we would have ended up with and would now be presiding over a vastly improved NDIS. I was a champion of the scheme when it was proposed. I'm a supporter of it now, but the flaws that it has are predominantly there because of the lack of lived experience in the guiding of the design and the processes around that. So those things, those policy implications would be different. We would not be scapegoating disabled folk in the way that we do in the Parliament. Like, in some ways, there's a really uncomfortable element to which I am the least threatening and most acceptable version of what the able-bodied majority of the Parliament thinks a disabled person both is and should be. Like, if I was an autistic person, or if I was deaf, or I was blind, or I had a different type of physical disability, there would be I would be received extraordinarily differently. And so in some ways, there's a lot of work still to do, even with me in there, to represent the broad diversity of the disability community in the place. So that would most certainly be different. And you know what, Christine? I think that politicians, the culture of Australian politics, would be far more responsive to those who are in desperate need of their voice being heard. When somebody contacts me with a constituent issue from the disability community, like, I get what it is like to be desperate to have an issue addressed, to literally have pinned how you think you'll do the next day on whether this person gets back to you, the urgency of the need to be taken seriously and listened to. And that just isn't a culture that exists in Australian politics at the minute. The idea of community service, the idea of this being a service role that's about the gathering of information, the presenting of it to the community, the empowering of individual community members through the resources that we have, that's foreign, completely foreign to the Australian political culture at the moment. And we would bring that with a force. There would be no more bureaucratic departmental responses within the next 6 to 8 months, and are you very grateful for that kind of thing? Because we understand how frustrating that is, because we live it.
Absolutely. That kind of segues nicely into what I was interested in next, which is about that role you have within the community. You don't just go to the Parliament. You're only at the Parliament for a certain number of days a year. It's actually a fairly limited amount of the year, but most of your work is done out in the community. You're a senator for Western Australia, which is an enormous patch of land.
It most certainly is, yes.
And I'm interested because there's a lot of people who just would never consider politics as an option. Clearly you were active in politics, but you weren't necessarily expecting to be in there. But there's a lot of people who have a real barrier around that sense that if they get in there, then they've sold out. You know, they're no longer connected to their community. They're not a genuine person. There's something fundamental about who they are that's going to change. How do you actually reconcile yourself with still being a part of the disability community and actually being a part of your local community that you represent, the people of Western Australia?
Well, I mean, it's a very, I think it's people that have that concern about people losing themselves when they're elected to Parliament. It's a very astute observation. I think it goes back to the fundamental nature of what a Westminster-based parliamentary system is about. We have a misconception that it's about fundamentally democracy and representation, when in fact that's not the history of the Westminster parliamentary system. The history of that system is, if we go back a couple of hundred years, it's about how the landed aristocracy administers their taxes as to not force them to keep killing the king, because that's quite inconvenient. And then from there, people have fought and died over generations to craft it into something that represents people's views, but it is still at its heart something which sings you a siren song of compromise and pragmatism and the ways one should behave, if you like, in order to maintain the status quo. And it is easy to get lost in that system. And so yes, we spend 20 weeks or 22 weeks of the year there, and I enjoy it because it's an opportunity to get answers to questions, to put things, you know, on the public record, to talk about issues and challenge that status quo. But I always look forward to greatly coming back to WA and reconnecting with my community. And whether I'm in WA or elsewhere, connecting with the disability community, because it energizes me. It reminds me why I got involved. It keeps my North Star, if you like, clear to me. Because otherwise you do get lost in an endless cycle of trying to maintain your position for the sole purpose of maintaining your position. And there's no faster way to lose your position either. That's the secret, you know. That's not what nobody tells you. There's no quicker way to get your ass kicked out of there than acting like that. But it is totally an unsatisfactory way of doing the job. So I don't have a bar of that. But I think people are right to be suspicious. They're right to want to hold people accountable. People say you should trust your politicians and your leaders. Well, I don't know if we've given you trust is something that is earned and built over time, and I don't think we've done a great job of doing that. So I intend to build that trust, but I never expect it, or indeed expect an inherent respect for the role from others from the disability community. Like I would never want somebody to treat me differently from our community because of my position, or for the community generally. Although my only caveat on that is that I do ask that people not from the disability community respect the role that I'm playing as a senator in the context of making sure that they recognise me as a parliamentarian and not as their conception of a disabled person, simply because of the fact that I'm a disabled person, if you like.
Yeah, and that always fascinates me, because clearly our major political parties haven't done desperately well at pre-selecting disabled people.
Yes.
You know, the diversity is pretty poor, and you know, we're still tackling the gender issue, which is, you know, pretty old hat, in fact, in diversity circles. So it's quite interesting that you talk about the kind of almost the stereotype of disability that people expect, and one of those is that I think this cuts to the heart of why we're not really in large numbers in leadership positions. There's an assumption that we just can't hack it, you know, that we are physically, we're just going to keel over, that we're not up for it. You know, you've got a massive flight backwards and forwards every time you come to Canberra.
Yes.
There's also that element of, you know, when it comes to tough decisions, we are a bit feeble. We're not going to be able to manage it. You know, some of those things. How do you, for any leader, self-care is a major plank of actually operating as a leader. But then as disability leaders, we've got this extra element as well of kind of sustaining our role. Otherwise, we almost prove them right.
Yes, look, I think that phrase you use is incredibly instructive. You know, this idea that we can't hack it. And I think the we can't hack it mentality pervades the employment space, the education space, you name it. And right there in that phrase is what we so fundamentally need to change about the way society understands disability. Because yes, people with disability are tough, as all people are tough, or have the, you know, toughness isn't a virtue in itself. You can be you can be tough, you can be not tough, you know, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But what is the thing, what is the nature of the barrier you're expected to be overcoming here? Is it something which results from your impairment? Or is it, which would be your medical conception of disability, you are disabled because you have an impairment? Or is it a barrier which has been created because of the discriminatory way in which society views disabled people, the inherent and drenched ableist nature of the thing, that the society has created subconsciously or consciously that barrier for that person to then have to work to overcome, in addition to the work that would be done in any and all leadership roles. And I think it's really important. There's this really toxic idea that I come across in the community. You know, I want to prove that I can do it just like everybody else. I'm not going to let this get me down. I'm not going to, you know, I'm not going to let it beat me. I'm going to do it just like everybody else. And my response to that is, well, I mean, good on you, but you shouldn't have to. You're not doing it just like everybody else. You're starting from 900 miles back, not because there's anything wrong with you, but because they decided to place you back there. So, you know, doing it like everybody else is when the job employment environment is accessible. It's when you are free of discrimination. It's when you have the appropriate aids to facilitate your engagement with the education system, or the test frameworks are modified to take account of your needs. That, when those things are done, you are doing it as everybody else is doing it. Otherwise, you're doing it with a ball and chain around your neck and legs, and you shouldn't be made to feel bad about that. So I don't. I take all of those things into account, and then considering this question of self-care and how you do that kind of stuff, Lord only knows, Christina. I will tell you when I find out. I think most parliamentarians have terrible work-life balances, and I'm not alone in that reality.
It's time for some coaching, she said in a modest fashion. That really illustrates, you know, the importance as well of role models. Where do you think we sit in the disability community with having the role models we need and actually needing some more?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I've been lucky enough to work with some incredible role models over my time and journey as an advocate and an activist. I think it's important to remember that the disability community is the same as any other minority community, in as much as it has its own prejudices, its politics, its sticky spots and difficult areas. And I've been lucky enough to be mentored by some wonderful people, Samantha Connor, Samantha Jenkinson, just to name a few, who've really given me some great tools to do that. It's important to remain self-reflective and to recognise that when we talk about disability, I am able to talk with great authority about my journey with with disability. I am not, maybe, I do not have the authority to talk, for instance, about a journey with an intellectual disability, or what it's like to be an autistic person. And so one of the things I think we've got to do as leaders in the community is understand when it is important to step forward and speak from our specific lived experience, and when it is important to call attention by reference to our general lived experience, and then to step back and to provide platforms for others to speak their truth and their lived experience as well. I think that's really important. I also would say that it is any leader of this community, I think, will do a great service to it when they are proud, or at least unashamed, to be a disabled person and to be a member of this community. This idea of disability pride, and finding pride in disability, is really revolutionary. And if we compare it to the journeys of other civil rights movements, of other communities, the women's rights movement, the movement of civil rights in America, that black pride, that pride in being a woman, that pride in being LGBTIQ, that's the catalyst to not only the success but the healing and the support that communities like ours can and should provide.
Fantastic, and great to hear you mention a couple of my favourite women. I'm just wondering, finally, who is a leader that you admire?
Well, I mean, look, I genuinely regard those two people as incredible leaders in their respective, just generally, like within the community, but just generally, and they are some of the most courageous, ballsy people that I know. I also have a great deal of respect for and I know this, if Rachel's watching, I swear to God, Rachel, I'm not sucking up to you, but Rachel Seward, who preceded me in the disability portfolio and continues to be our other senator for WA, she is one of the most incredible parliamentarians and activists and advocates that I have ever seen and have been lucky enough to work with. You can't understand until you occupy it how many incentives exist for politicians to pay no attention whatsoever to issues of social justice or issues of social services. They are complex, they are multifaceted, and they are almost totally devoid from any immediate electoral dividend. And so you couldn't get issues where it is more, sometimes there's less incentive for a politician to engage. Rachel knows it back to front, leftwards and sidewards, and can give you the history on all of it. And she fights. She has the fire in the belly from those issues, and does the work tremendously, and has been a wonderful guide to me in my time in this job. And I really couldn't ask to be working with a better colleague.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jordon Steele-John. It's been really wonderful to catch up with you and to talk leadership, politics, part of community. It's just a wonderful thing. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katrina. It's been great. Christina, sorry.
That's
it's been
okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you.